Sometimes a good connection makes all the difference in the world. I think it's fair to say that our world has been severely disrupted in the past 3 weeks. And I think it's fair to say that your world has probably been severely disrupted in the past 3 weeks. Whatever your normal routine was, chances are that's been disrupted. Whatever normal relationships you have, those have probably been distanced. The systems and worlds that you used to have that made you feel normal have now been completely reorganized and redone in response to this crisis. During a time of crisis, connection is one of the most important things that you have, because a good connection makes all the difference in the world. In John 15, we see the disciples' world is about ready to be completely disrupted. Everything that they were used to, everything that they did, everything that was a normal part of their world was about ready to be gone. Because Jesus revealed that He was no longer going to be with them. In the midst of this crisis for them, though, Jesus does something astounding. In John 15, He points them towards connection in the middle of the crisis. Because a good connection makes all the difference in the world. In John 15, Jesus says this in verse 1. He says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser." In a manner of speaking, He's saying, listen, this world belongs to God and everything in it. And when He was saying that He was the true vine, Israel was always used to being called the vine in the Old Testament. You see, they were God's chosen people, and they were designed to produce fruit in the areas that belonged to God. But there was a problem. No matter what they tried to do, they could never produce the fruit that God desired them to. So what Jesus is telling them is saying, listen, I know there was a gap. I know there was a gap between what you wanted to produce and what you actually could produce. But I am the true vine, and what Israel and what God's people were always incapable of producing, I have done that once and for all, and that I am the true vine. And He goes on a little bit later in verse 2, and He says, you know what? All those branches that aren't producing fruit, we're going to get rid of those. And the branches that are producing fruit, we're going to do something in their lives and in their world in order that they can produce more fruit. So why is this comforting in the middle of the crisis that the disciples are facing? I think it was comforting because what Jesus was telling them is that even in the middle of this crisis is that God is still in control. Just because they are facing circumstances or a chapter in their lives that is uncertain, it doesn't mean that their connection with God is going to be interrupted. And that's important because a good connection makes all the difference in the world. See, He continues talking about connection, and it gets better and it becomes more important in verses 3 and 4. He tells them this. He says, already you are clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. As the branch itself cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. You see, in the middle of this crisis, in the middle of all these things that were uncertain in their time, he tells them that God is in control, but he also points them into connection, and he says, listen, I have already made you clean. The barriers that used to be able to block that connection, I have removed those, and now what I want you to do is to abide in me, and I will abide in you. You see, Jesus points them to a connection. Here's why this is important. I want to show you something over here. You see, the old way and the old system was this, that your production determined your connection. What you did and who you were determined your connection with God. But Jesus is pointing to a new way. He tells them that your connection determines your production. You see, that makes all of the difference in the world. Because in the middle of the crisis, it's not about what you can produce. It's not about how good you are, or if you can follow the rules, or you doing everything the same way that you used to before. When their entire world is being disrupted, he is telling them that you need to have your connection, and your connection determines your production. Your connection is going to determine whether this is a situation that you survive, or whether this can be a situation in which you can actually thrive. You see, Jesus is pointing them to a connection because their world was totally disrupted and everything was going to change. But God pointed them to a connection through Jesus because a good connection makes all the difference in the world. You see, if they were capable of staying connected to Jesus, then instead of just getting through this crisis, instead of just getting through this disruption, instead of just having everything that's normal going differently, Jesus says, I don't want you just to get through this. I want you to grow through this. So maybe this crisis we're facing, maybe it's not something that you are just meant to survive. Maybe this is a situation where God is telling you that you need to stay connected, because that connection will determine what you produce. It's going to determine whether you just get through this or you grow through this. Your connection is going to determine whether this is something that you just survive or a situation where you actually thrive in this world. I want to ask you a question. What or who are you connected to during this time? Because your connection is going to determine what's produced in your life. You see, your connection is going to determine whether fear and isolation and loneliness are produced in your life. Or your connection is going to determine if you thrive. I want to share something with you. I want to share that when you don't have a good connection, you are always going to be tempted to turn to coping. When you and I in our lives do not have a strong connection, we are always going to turn to coping. You know, this week we learned that 6.6 million Americans have filed for unemployment. That's 6.6 million people that are questioning whether or not they're going to have enough financial resources just to make it through the next week or the next month. That's 6.6 million people that have been entirely disrupted because of this distancing and disorganization. I read another statistic this week. And it said alcohol sales in the past week have grown by 55%, according to one study. Now listen, some of that percentage, inarguably, is because people aren't going to bars or restaurants anymore. But I believe there's also a large percentage of that it's people who are coping because they have lost their connections. You see, I think there's a large percentage of people that don't have a true connection and are turning to coping because now loneliness and isolation has set in. And maybe for you, it's not alcohol. Maybe for you, it's just binging on dessert. Maybe for you, it's just food. Maybe for you, you are coping through a different way. Maybe for you, you've watched every single episode of Tiger King, and now you're just binging another show because you're coping, hoping that it results in a connection. You see, God never designed the world that way, and He didn't want that for His disciples, and He didn't want that for the world. So God pointed them towards this connection where Jesus says, listen, abide in me, and I will abide in you. He's talking about connection, and a connection is important because a good connection makes all the difference in the world. And in verse 11, he highlights this in John chapter 15. In verse 11, he says this. He says, I have told you these things to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. You see, Jesus told them about this connection because He didn't want them just to get through it. He wanted them to grow through it. Jesus told them about this connection because He didn't want them just to survive this. He wanted them to thrive in the middle of this new reality where they found themselves in. You see, He didn't want them to go back to coping mechanisms of about it being about what they could do or how good they were or the rules that they followed. No, He wanted them to have this intimate connection so they could have life and be filled with joy. And He wants the exact same thing in your life. See, when He says this, that connection changes things. That connection changes their ability to have joy even in the midst of circumstances they cannot control. You see, that connection changes their ability to thrive in this situation. This connection changes their ability to make it through and grow. See, it changes everything. It even changed the way that they were viewed in God's eyes. I love this quote by Bob Goff. He says this. He says, Jesus didn't want us to be believers. He wanted us to be participants. You see, Jesus was pointing them to a connection, and it was never just about what they believed. He wanted them to be a participant in the story that God was writing. You know, God set this beautiful story in motion when Jesus came to earth and He brought heaven to earth. And He did it with us in mind because He knew that you had an active part in this story that He wanted you to write as He brought restoration into people's lives and into the world. You see, I think this is why he continues on in verse 12. He says this, He says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that you lay down your life for a friend. And you are my friends. No longer, in verse 15, do I call you servants, for a servant only does what the master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. And you did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask my Father in my name, he will give it to you. These things I have commanded you, so that you love one another. In verse 17, we see that Jesus actually commands this connection. And the reason he commands this connection is because you are called to share your connection. So instead of just being a group of people that merely survive this or merely get through this, no, he wants to have a connection with you so that you can actually grow during this time and thrive during this time, and that you can show and share your connection through loving one another. Now, a recent survey we did revealed that what most people are missing during this time is connection. That's why we equipped you with these neighbor cards that are available on our Facebook page. You see, we equipped these cards with you so that you could share a connection with a neighbor. And connection is powerful because a good connection may be one of the most important things in the world. And your connection, the connection that you are capable of sharing, can absolutely change someone's world. And Jesus commanded this connection so that the world may be able to see what he did and what he's doing, even in the midst of circumstances and chapters that people cannot control. You know, Jesus broke down the barriers between this connection. And now he's calling us to break down the barriers that make people feel like they don't have a connection. He's commanding us to love one another and to share our connection. To share our connection with our neighbor. And to start conversations so they're not sitting alone and just coping, that they can have a connection. And connections are important because they can change somebody's world. You are called to spread love through this connection that you have with the Father. I want to challenge you with a thought. I want to challenge you with these two questions. I want to challenge you and just ask you, are you connected or are you coping? And some of you are saying, well, what's the difference? How will I know which one I'm doing? And I'm going to ask you to say what is being produced in your life. And the second question I want to ask you is this. Who is someone that you can or should share your connection with? Because the reality is this. During this time of crisis, in this chapter of all of our stories, and in the midst of all these things that we can't control, Jesus is inviting you to have a connection with him. But in the absence of a true connection, we are always going to be tempted to turn towards coping. So are you just coping? Or are you connecting? And maybe, just like the disciples, maybe God has commanded this connection to challenge you to go and share this connection. Because a good connection makes all the difference in the world. And maybe the connection that you are meant to share with somebody can make all the difference in their world. So maybe the person you share a connection with goes from just surviving the situation to being able to start thriving in a situation. Maybe the person that you're sharing a connection with was just hoping to get through it, but now because of the connection you shared and you pointing them to Jesus, instead of just getting through, they said, I'm going to grow through this. So are you coping or are you connecting? Connection is important, and a good connection makes all the difference in the world. I want to share a couple things with you as we end our time. For those of you who are watching this video on YouTube, I want to encourage you with 3 ways that you can give. The first way is if you go on our website, beaconchurch.us, and you're going to find a little tab for giving. The second way I want to encourage you is to look up our app, whether it's on the Play Store or it's on the App Store through Apple products. Beacon Church IL. It is the one way that you can stay connected with us. Or finally, you can just mail any offering you have to 622 North Franklin in Litchfield, Illinois. And I want to point you again to our app. Because everything we're doing and everything that you need to stay updated on is going to happen through our app. Jesus is inviting you to a connection in the midst of this crisis. And a good connection makes all the difference in the world.